Brunonians far and wide, elders and newest students, the glorious but not yet arrived class of 24, our regalia says it's Convocation Day, no matter how unusual. And as always, I bid you pray. These prayers draw on the prophet Micah, who asks, "And what does the Lord require? That you love justice, do kindness, and walk humbly with God." From Frederick Douglass, who wrote, "I prayed for 20 years, but received no answer until I prayed with my legs." From the 20th century rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who records, "For many of us, the march from Selma to Montgomery was about protest and prayer. Legs are not lips, and walking is not kneeling, and yet our legs uttered songs. Even without words, our march was worship. I felt my legs were praying." And from Adrienne Rich's poem, Final Notation, "You are taking parts of us to places never planned. You're going far away with pieces of our lives. It will be short. It will take all your breath. It will not be simple. It will become your will." Strengthened by this wisdom, I bid you pray. Head, heart, and legs. Hear and hold us as of old. Grief and loss cloud our nation, our world, our university. Almost amazed, we gather, grateful for health and profound privilege that's been created by family, benefactors, faculty, and a vast set of university leaders whose generous imagination and tireless work built the path we walk through today, through these imaginary gates and into this term. We are apart in body, but we are joined in heart. We are Brunonians. Grant us humility and gracious humor to navigate carefully, if awkwardly, masked, distanced, even worried, but finding privilege in caring for and encouraging each other. We hear the wisdom of the great souls who trod before us in trying seasons. We've named them. We don't know all their names, and yet they infuse us with courage to stride beyond any isolating fear or self-interest, to walk toward a beloved community. Grant us courageous acuity. Sorrow's harsh light shines on racism's deadly national injustice. May our protests yield new structures and maps, streets, monuments, bridges, named now to honor those who dismantled wrong and built good. Surely this is our work, sacred hope. In Deus Speramus has long been Brunonians' calling. Autumn beckons and corroborates that the season of hardship will turn. Hope's shores still await us. As we yearn to arrive, we step across confines of identity to insist on our neighbor's good, to release the imprisoned, to welcome the stranger, to shield the vulnerable. Without equivocation, we shout, Black Lives Matter everywhere, on College Hill, at our State House, in church and mosque and temple, from sea to shining sea. A whispered reply of joy may yet come to our ears from children released from fear and trauma, nightmares transformed into songs of justice flourishing. Grateful Brunonians for all that sustains us in life and brings us to this day, let us open the path of blessing that Rich imagines. It is the right one and will take us to places never planned, requiring our breath and our song. It will not be simple, but together with our legs, it will become our will. It will become our hope. It will become our walking prayer. May we become and create blessing for others this day and always. Amen.
Members of the Brown community, faculty, staff, alumni, parents, and students, it is my great pleasure as president of Brown University to declare the 257th academic year open. I want to welcome members of the entering classes of the medical school, graduate school, and the college. Among them are 813 doctoral and master's students, 144 medical students, 6 resumed undergraduate education students, individuals who have gained valuable life experience between high school and their entrance to Brown, 62 very wise transfer students, and 1,769 first-year students, the core of the Brown University class, the great Brown University class of 2024, who will join us in the spring. By that time, I hope that all of Brown's newest students will have the opportunity to walk through the Van Wickle gates, and that by then it'll be safe to have another welcoming convocation on the main green, perhaps a little colder, but in person. Before I make a few remarks and introduce our keynote speaker, I want to thank the people at Brown who have worked tirelessly to prepare for this academic year. To name just a few, our facilities and dining services employees who have had to reimagine what it means to feed, house, and educate a community during a pandemic, our campus life events and communication staff members who have thrown themselves into safely bringing our students back to campus, our computing and information services employees working with our digital design team and the Sheridan Center staff to help prepare faculty for hybrid teaching, the many employees plus students who served on the numerous reopening committees through the summer, and of course, our faculty who have worked tirelessly to not only reinvent their own courses, but the entire Brown curriculum to fit a hybrid 3-semester model. They deserve our gratitude for making it possible to open the academic year. Now, this is always a joyful day filled with excitement about the academic year ahead. But as we all know, this year is unlike any others. The pandemic has upended life across our community, our state, our country, and our world. And while we no doubt face challenges as a Brown community, we will face challenges this year, we have to be mindful of the devastating impacts this virus has already had. So many of us have personally experienced the effects of the pandemic in our lives. We may have family members and friends who have been ill or who have lost jobs. And we've missed out on celebrating milestones with our loved ones, visiting relatives, enjoying concerts and movies and parties and all of the other things that people do together to enjoy life and to make meaningful connections. Now, despite these challenges, despite them, our deep commitment to education and research is as strong as ever. Because Brown's mission of discovering, communicating, and preserving knowledge and understanding in a spirit of free inquiry has never been more important. We've seen in the past months that the need for knowledge and understanding is urgent. Consider just some of today's complex challenges: racial injustice, socioeconomic inequality, climate change, political polarization, not to mention the COVID-19 pandemic. Grappling with these challenges requires the concerted and thoughtful efforts of people from across disciplines. Biologists and data scientists working alongside epidemiologists, artists and philosophers next to political scientists. We need analysts, advocates, activists. But although all of the disciplines represented at Brown advance knowledge on issues of consequence, I would argue that it's especially important right now to not forget the lessons of history that are so relevant to the challenges we're dealing with today. While the circumstances we're currently living in are extraordinary, it's important to recognize that previous generations have faced similar challenges. But often the lessons of the past are only partially remembered, and at times nearly forgotten, hampering our ability to learn from prior human experience. Our histories are imperfect and incomplete. Over time, societies, often led by those in positions of power, selectively choose what we will honor and remember. And when this happens, it falls to scholars to unearth important lessons that have been forgotten. 3 examples of this selective forgetting seem especially relevant today. The first concerns the lessons from the 1918-19 influenza pandemic, which resulted in about 50 million deaths worldwide. Until last spring, this pandemic, which bears some striking similarities to COVID-19, had largely vanished from public consciousness. We now know that those living at this time experienced school closures, event cancellations, resistance to mask-wearing directives, in addition to experiencing the trauma of illness and death among loved ones. Now, even though Brown stayed open during that pandemic, very little about that period exists in Brown archives. In the Brown Daily Herald, there's a mention of a campus lockdown and guards stationed at the gates to keep students in and other people out, and the university president advising students to dress warmly as a protective measure. But that's about it. In hindsight, it's clear we could have been better prepared for today's challenges if the influenza pandemic had not been all but forgotten. In 2006, an epidemiologist named Stephen Morse from Columbia University School of Public Health wrote a prescient article titled "Pandemic Influenza: Studying the Lessons of History." He noted other research that established that the cities that emphasized the same basic public health practices we're following today, social distancing, mask wearing, isolating the sick, banning large gatherings, these cities had fewer deaths. The last sentence in his article, written 16 years ago, says that, quote, "The lessons of 1918, if well heeded, might help us to avoid repeating the same history today." The irony, of course, is that this time we didn't heed the lessons of history as quickly as we could have. It took the Centers for Disease Control 3 months from the first recorded case of coronavirus in the US to reverse course and recommend mask wearing, giving the virus that much more time to spread silently among communities. A second example of imperfectly remembered history concerns our celebration this year of the passage of the 19th Amendment 100 years ago, giving women the right to vote. And the 19th Amendment was indeed a victory that it should be remembered, it should be honored. But as we celebrate, let's not forget that the 19th Amendment actually didn't guarantee all women the right to vote. Indeed, for many women, it meant that they had simply gained the right to be disqualified from voting for the same reasons that already applied to men: failure to pass literacy tests or to pay poll taxes, supposed immorality or insanity, felony convictions, and more. These disqualifications kept many women and men who were Black, Native American, recent immigrants, or just plain poor from accessing the voting booth. And it would take an extraordinary 45 more years from the time of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But even that didn't settle it. Today, many people are still cut off from civic participation due to prior convictions. And more generally, the issue of whether the Voting Rights Act needs to be updated and strengthened is hotly debated. So, as we celebrate the 19th Amendment and head into the fall election, let's not forget that the fight for voting rights is still very much underway. My third and final example is something that should be familiar to all Brown students and employees, and that is the university's historic ties to the slave trade. This fall, all incoming first-year and transfer students will read the celebrated Report on Slavery and Justice, published in 2006, written by a committee of Brown University faculty, students, and administrators. This report, carefully researched, powerfully written, documents the uncomfortable truth that slavery and the slave trade were pervasive throughout Rhode Island. The economy of our state was heavily dependent on slavery, and Brown University benefited from the slave trade. I encourage everyone to read this report if you haven't already. Now, one of the recommendations from that report was to create a permanent memorial to recognize the ties that Brown and Rhode Island had to the transatlantic slave trade. Now, if this had been a normal convocation, all of the new students would have marched in through the Van Wickle gates and they would have observed across the quiet green the powerful memorial sculpture created by Martin Puryear. It appears as a ball and chain, only the top third of which emerges from the earth, capturing the idea that the legacy of slavery is a weight that is still partially buried. And it reminds us that it's our responsibility to expose that history, look unflinchingly at its current terrible manifestations, and become part of a process of healing as we deepen our understanding and work together to effect change. This is the work of decades, not a single moment, but it's one that we as a university will bring renewed commitment to this year. As members of this community, one of the most important things our students learn is to develop a foundation that allows them to live lives of meaning and purpose through understanding and empathy. That means understanding and honoring the moment we're in and the challenges we're all facing right now. I challenge you, wherever you are, as a student in your academic career, as a faculty or staff member in your professional career, to deliberately mark the trials of this academic year in your personal consciousness, and to take steps to memorialize the adversity that we're facing today. I also challenge you to act, because how we act as a community now will define how we are remembered in the future. Remember the history of the 1918-19 influenza pandemic and commit to wearing a mask and making sacrifices in your social lives. In other words, don't party, please. Remember the continuing fight for voting rights and either mail in your ballot or go to the polls this fall. Remember the history of the transatlantic slave trade and do your part to dismantle anti-Black racism at Brown and in this nation. And let's make sure that it's a year that is never forgotten. Now, it is my privilege to introduce Professor Andre C. Willis, Associate Professor of Religious Studies. Professor Willis has a PhD from Harvard, and he came to Brown in 2012 from Yale Divinity School. His scholarship is broad. He has written extensively on 18th century philosopher David Hume, and he also writes and teaches on topics like Christianity and economic inequality and African American theology. Professor Willis exemplifies the very best of what Brown offers. He is beloved by his students. To give but one example of the impact he has, one student said the following, and I quote, "Professor Willis is the single most responsive, accommodating, and compassionate professor I've had in 4 years at Brown. Never have I seen a professor demonstrate such commitment to his students as human beings first and students second, to intellectual and emotional honesty, and to a deeply self-reflexive pedagogy." Now, he's also a wonderful citizen of the university. Professor Mark Cladis, the department chair of the Religious Studies Department, wrote the following: "The Department of Religious Studies is honored to have Professor Willis as a colleague and teacher scholar. He brings his brilliant mind, his capacious heart, and enlivening spirit to everything he does, and he does so much. He educates his colleagues and students alike about what it is to become better people, better citizens, and to become more knowledgeable about such topics as racism and historical trauma. Andre helps us to become more human and more humane." So today, I am especially grateful that Professor Willis has agreed to co-chair with Vice President Shante Delalue Brown's Task Force on Anti-Black Racism, which will begin its work this fall. And I want to ask you to all please join me in welcoming Professor Andre Willis, whose talk is titled "The New Normal." Thank you.
Thank you, President Paxson. It's an extraordinary honor and a unique privilege to be able to welcome you to Brown University. And it means something to really welcome each and every one of you. So I want to take the first of the 15 minutes I've been allotted to welcome you, students of all ages, those of you who are coming to Brown directly from high school, those who are coming from other jobs, or those who are in another college, a community college, folks who took a gap year or were doing military service, RU students, transfer students, and students who literally have been doing nothing at all or something I couldn't think of. Welcome. I welcome you from all nations, all socioeconomic classes, all races, cultures, and creeds. Welcome. I extend my heartiest welcome to each and every one of you, all of you right now. I'm glad you're here. And what a historic entrance this is. To start your time at Brown right now, whether you're in Providence or not, is to honor a commitment to behave in ways that reduce the risk of passing on the coronavirus. I take this to be a moral commitment, an ethical obligation to protect the well-being of others, especially the most vulnerable. And let me stress that when a community comes together, even virtually, and agrees to make this kind of commitment, it requires a collective sacrifice to see it through. For Brown, the collective sacrifice required de-densification of campus and having 3 semesters. That's why most of you are not physically on campus right now. I begin by highlighting the moral features of the enterprise we are currently undertaking so that its significance is not reduced to just the practices of masking, hand washing, and social distancing. Beyond those vital habits, which all of us have integrated into our daily practices, we can say that the gravity of this moment has compelled us as an institution to begin this year from a new ethical outlook, what I want to think of as the new normal. It is our task to build on these ethical foundations. The new normal we make should be guided by the habits that have driven Brown's response so far, habits of mutuality and fallibilism. Mutuality is the habit for shared equal connections, and fallibilism is the capacity to change one's mind. For those of you who study American philosophy, these categories are not new. What we do as a community post-COVID-19, particularly given the vast inequalities that it has reinforced and further exposed, will define this university for the next generation. Together, then, we will create the new normal for this university, a new normal that hopefully elevates mutuality, both inside of our university and beyond it, and stresses fallibilism, that our perspective can shift on an issue and we can change our stance. Let me give 2 examples for the sake of clarity. First, on August 19, 2020, this institution changed its official name from Brown University in Providence in the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations to just Brown University. This is an example of fallibilism. After 226 years, the institution assessed the current evidence, consulted with experts, and changed its mind as to what it should be called. Fallibilists hold that our beliefs always need revision. Second, on July 29th, 2020, this institution upheld a commitment it made in 2006 to support the Providence Public Schools with a permanent endowment of $10 million. The rationale for this was complicated, but for heuristic purposes here, we can say that Brown recognized that its future as an institution is intimately connected to the future of the city of Providence and the flourishing of its citizens. This is an example of mutuality. I should take care, however, to not go too far emphasizing future possibilities and the habits that might ground our new normal without appropriately acknowledging that this is also a time of great sadness and extraordinary loss. For some of us, these last 6 months seem to have taken more than we had to give. The pain it has cost so many of us just to get here, just to make it to this day, has been monumental. It makes sense then that we may be feeling deep disappointment or experiencing anxiety, fear, and anger. I honor those feelings, and I want you to know that I'm sorry we're not all together right now on the quad celebrating the beginning of the fall semester. For what it's worth, you should know that none of us wanted it to be this way, and we all look forward to the intellectual energy of an actual classroom full of curious Brown students. We can't wait to experience the rich dynamism of our physical campus when it's at capacity. For right now, at this opening convocation, this new beginning, I think there are intellectual and emotional resources to be gleaned from simply being present to the energy that gets created at this instant when strangers become traveling partners and when disparate individuals start to form a loose collective. There's a particular joy I get when people that ostensibly disagree are able to come into temporary alignment of intention or embrace a provisional solidarity of purpose. My joy, however, is a joy that's made lucid by grief, a grief that demands us, again, as we commence the process of laboring and learning together, to create this university anew. For Brown will be what we make it. And whether we like it or not, together, we create the post-COVID way of being for this university. If this way forward is shaped by moral and intellectual habits of mutuality and fallibility, it will be a new normal that, if effectively calibrated, can reverberate a transformative energy for our campus and throughout the state, the nation, and even the world. If it is shaped by the illusion that we are, individually and institutionally, separate from worldly concerns, or the belief that we are unable to change our stances on a variety of issues, then we will confirm that we are not worthy of our privilege. This year has taught us that we can no longer tacitly co-sign the myth that the life of the mind is to be cordoned off from the rest of one's life. For we now know that any form of study that ignores the plight of the planet and its peoples is a form of corruption. One's academic work simply cannot be fractured from the rest of their existence. Scholarly endeavors always speak to the needs of the world in some way or another. Thus, to engage in the life of the mind is always to engage in the life of the world. And this is a time of reckoning. We've learned that we are not insulated from the slow violence of poverty and its effects, which diminish the lives of millions across the globe, many in this city and some at this institution. We've witnessed the daily impacts of a pending climate apocalypse that threaten the Earth's stability. And we've come to recognize that we can't turn a blind eye to the increasing militarization of the nations of the world. We ignore these problems along with the terrors of race hatred, gender inequality, and violence against trans and queer folks at our own peril. And we confront them practicing habits of mutuality and fallibilism for the preservation of something greater than just this university. That something is intellectual integrity. For what does it mean to be a student at a time when the world seems like it's spinning out of control? It means that education cannot be either luxury or distraction. No, study is a site of empowerment and the growth of the moral imagination. And a serious commitment to learning should be thought of as a moral act, especially in the midst of crisis and upheaval. Intense reading and writing when the world seems to be on fire helps us develop more self-awareness and a keen knowledge of how broader economic, cultural, and political forces function, two key features of the intellectual and moral habits of mutuality and fallibilism. And I want to remind you that no matter what you're planning on studying, research, reflection, reading, and writing that you do, both in sciences and humanities, always links to a larger vision of the world and the way things work. Everything you learn ends up being a part of the world you will make. Protest and learning are not completely disparate acts that take place in separate silos, for the terms of any protest are always based on a set of ideas and conceptions, and the vision that drives activism is always grounded in a set of norms and ideals. Conversely, much of what we study is a consequence of previous disputes and past contestations that made claims for the importance of a particular discipline over others and emphasized the value of one method over another. The point is that to spend your time alone right now, reading and writing, even if you are at home and taking only one free class this semester, is to be situated in a legacy of the clash of ideas, and it's often difficult to see that. Also, educating yourself can be a form of activism against structural injustices in spaces of learning that aren't very well practiced in the habits of mutuality and fallibilism. When African-American folks of my generation first went to school, now I'm talking elementary school, not college, our very speech patterns and ways of talking were under direct assault. And this discourse on Ebonics was not just background noise. It was a matter of how you were actually assessed. It wasn't simply the case that your grammar and syntax were labeled as incorrect. No, it was that the way you talk seemed to mark you and your family as deficient. Now, as the debate about Black English continued to rage, whatever talents we may have displayed in school for anything other than athletics, dancing, and singing didn't seem to warrant a lot of attention. It was assumed that Black students were trapped in a cycle of poverty, shaped by a depraved culture, and stuck in neighborhoods that were full of degenerates. Thus, they just weren't worth the time of investment. The horizon of possibility that we saw for our lives was shrinking right before our very eyes. Then, as some of us arrived in colleges and universities, we were labeled as unqualified, and our presence was attributed to the fact that quotas needed to be fulfilled. We were also chastised for sitting together in the cafeteria and accused of taking advantage of the system when we received financial aid and did work-study jobs. To make matters worse, there was broad support for pseudo-scientific studies that concluded Black people were intellectually inferior to whites due to their genetic makeup. We would actually go to classes, sometimes required classes, where professors stood firmly by this new and exciting data. As in the worst kinds of tragedies, the absurd had become the predictable. The few of us remaining in school knew we were larger than anything they could say about us, but often it was hard to figure out if that mattered at all. Now, the best of our literary tradition tells what this feels like from the inside. I just give a brief sketch of this harm to show how the commitment to study can be a form of activism. But it also grounds the two final points I want to leave you with before I close. The first is that when you hear someone longing for the familiarity of a return to things as they were, I ask you to please help them qualify that statement. Sure, I want to put COVID-19 behind us, but I don't want to return to that normal. I want to help create a new normal. And even though progress can sometimes seem impossibly out of reach, I want you to remember that hope is a consequence of action. The action you are called to is study. And while there's no precedent for where we are, I've tried to identify a possible blueprint that is guided by habits of mutuality and fallibilism that can bring us closer to where we need to be. Second, at its most simple, the practice of mutuality begins with the question, how can I be a better friend? The habit of fallibilism starts with the question, how can I be a better thinker? I've watched too many Black men take their final steps this summer in encounters with law enforcement officers. The brutality that we've all witnessed against Black people at the hands of the state is just sickening. Among other things, it's a reflection of the racist presuppositions that Black male bodies are to be feared and destroyed. The collective trauma of witnessing or even hearing about incident after incident has been hard to bear. It's left so many of us with the burden of extraordinary pain and loss on top of the scars that we're already grappling with. Some may carry this pain visibly, others less so. But I think we have to be patient with each other and begin with kindness, even as we work against these things that are wrong. We must be better friends to each other. The stakes are high right now. The new normal we make will depend on all of us supporting one another in developing habits of mutuality and fallibility, and then working in solidarities with others outside of the university. To do my part, I'm teaching a not-for-credit class, Univ 1111, that aims to strengthen our habits of mutuality. Please join that class and show up when you can. And I'm serving on a task force on anti-Black racism as a way to think better and assist this institution in the practice of fallibilism. Please help us when you can, if you are called upon. This institution needs each and every one of us to help create the new normal guided by practices of mutuality and fallibilism. The road ahead will be rocky, but if we all chip in to help with the work that is in front of us, we will have a positive effect on the variety of problems we are now facing. So welcome. You are now officially in the Brown family, so let's get it. Thank you.
Alma mater, we hail thee with loyal devotion, and bring to thine altar our offerings of praise. Our hearts swell within us with joyful emotion as the name of Old Brown in loud chorus we raise. The happiest moments of youth's fleeting hours we've passed 'neath the shade of these time-honored walls, and sorrows as transient as April's brief shower